Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. How often do we hear the phrase critical thinking thrown around? It's everywhere, right? In school, at the office, even just scrolling through your feed. Well, today we are going to completely demystify what it actually means to be a real critical thinker. We're going to break this massive concept down by looking through three foundational academic perspectives: philosophy, psychology, and education. And then we'll take those concepts and show you exactly how to apply logical reasoning in practice, so you can start making better decisions right away. So, here is our agenda for today. We'll kick things off by defining critical thinking. Next, we'll explore the philosophical perspective, followed by the psychological perspective, and then the educational perspective. Finally, we'll wrap it all up with logical arguments and reasoning.
All right, Section 1, Defining Critical Thinking, Unpacking the Process. Let's make sure we're totally on the same page about what this term means before we dive into the deep end. At its core, critical thinking is an active, intellectually disciplined process. If we look at how experts defined it back in 1990, it's really about actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, and synthesizing information to guide what you believe and how you act. It is fundamentally built on concepts and principles rather than just blindly following some rigid, step-by-step checklist. Basically, critical thinking isn't just a static trait you're born with. It's an intellectual skill, kind of like a muscle, that you have to continuously train and improve over time. Now, it's super important to remember that being a critical thinker doesn't magically guarantee you're going to uncover the absolute truth or have a perfect conclusion every single time. But it absolutely will drastically improve your cognitive skills and your judgment as you keep practicing.
Moving on to Section 2, the philosophical perspective, the ideal thinker. This approach has some incredibly deep roots, going all the way back to ancient heavyweights like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.
Philosophy traditionally approaches critical thinking by treating the thinker as an absolute ideal. It leans really heavily on the formal rules of logic and rational inquiry. Essentially, philosophers are asking, what are human beings capable of doing under the absolute best, most optimal circumstances? Think of it as the flawless superhero version of human thought. So the main takeaway here is that this philosophical perspective sets very rigid, universal standards for rationality. It defines the ideal thinker as completely detached from our everyday, messy human limitations. When philosophers look at critical thinking, they're picturing a flawless application of logic, totally unbothered by distractions, cognitive fatigue, or missing information.
But let's be real. What about how we actually think in our day-to-day lives? We aren't perfect logical machines, right? And that brings us to Section 3, the psychological perspective, the reality of cognition.
Cognitive psychology radically shifts our focus away from that philosophical ideal and grounds us in practical reality. It examines the actual mental processes, the strategies, and the representations that we use out in the real world to solve problems and learn new things. It looks at the human brain not as a flawless processor, but exactly as it truly operates out in the wild. Interestingly, embracing this reality means acknowledging that our thinking is heavily swayed by outside factors. Psychology factors in the messiness of our intuition and our emotions. It recognizes that social, cultural, and environmental influences have a huge impact on our cognition. And because it views critical thinking as a process influenced by natural human tendencies, it accepts that there's a huge amount of variability in how well different individuals actually think.
When you put these two perspectives head to head, the contrast is pretty striking. Philosophy is over here assuming best-case rationality and setting strict universal standards. Meanwhile, psychology is studying our real and, let's face it, sometimes flawed human tendencies and limitations. Basically, philosophy focuses on what should be, while psychology focuses on what actually is.
Okay, on to Section 4, the educational perspective, teaching how to think. This third prism looks at how we actually cultivate these skills in academic and professional settings.
Rather than focusing entirely on the abstract ideals of philosophy or purely on the cognitive limitations studied in psychology, educators observe students directly in the classroom. The goal is to figure out teachable dimensions of thinking. Education treats critical thinking as a verb, an action. It emphasizes actively evaluating information, distinguishing facts from opinions, questioning assumptions, and making evidence-based judgments. Honestly, this is probably the exact version of critical thinking you were graded on back in school.
To actually structure this kind of teaching effectively, Benjamin Bloom and his team developed a really powerful framework back in 1956 known as Bloom's taxonomy.
This framework is specifically designed to scaffold how we process information, helping us level up from basic cognitive tasks to much higher, more complex cognitive levels over time.
Let's look at how this builds. As you climb the hierarchy, you start at the base with knowledge and comprehension, and then move up to application. But here is the kicker. The top 3 levels, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, those are the activities that truly represent higher-level critical thinking. So for instance, when you're at work evaluating a new proposal to make a final judgment call, you are operating at the absolute peak of critical thought.
Which brings us to our final section, number 5, logical arguments and reasoning. Let's put all this theory into practice by exploring the structural foundation of critical thought. This is where we take the skills educators taught us and apply them to test those philosophical ideals in the real psychological world.
Now, in logic, an argument is definitely not a shouting match between two angry people. Instead, it's a highly specific structure. It's a group of statements where one or more truth candidates, which we call premises, provide the reasons or the evidence to support one clear conclusion. And in this structure, every single premise, as well as the conclusion, has to be capable of being either true or false.
We can basically split these logical arguments into 2 main camps. First, you have deductive arguments, where if your premises are true, your conclusion is a logical consequence and absolutely must be true. Second, you have inductive arguments, where the truth of the conclusion is only supported by the probability of the premises. Inductive arguments are generalizations, meaning the premises give good support to the conclusion, but they don't 100% guarantee it.
Let's zoom in on deductive reasoning for a second. This moves from the general to the specific. A simple math example. If A equals B and B equals C, it necessarily follows that A equals C, right? Or a classic logic example. If all humans are mortal and all Greeks are human, it's a completely valid argument that all Greeks are mortal. Boom. The truth of that conclusion is mathematically guaranteed.
On the flip side, inductive reasoning goes the exact opposite way, from specific instances up to general conclusions. Imagine you notice a low-cost airline flight is delayed. Then you observe a pattern. 20 more flights from low-cost airlines also get delayed. From that, you might build a theory that low-cost airlines always have delays. That's a highly probable conclusion based on your observation, but unlike our deductive example, it isn't an absolute mathematical guarantee.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on. As you navigate your own education, your career, and just your everyday life, which form of reasoning do you rely on more to make sense of this incredibly complex world? Do you find yourself constantly seeking the absolute, flawless certainty of deductive reasoning? Or do you lean on the practical, pattern-recognizing nature of inductive reasoning? Keep thinking critically about it, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.